Hello, I'm Casey Johnson. My Makerspace project is about the digital divide. I chose this picture for this first slide on purpose because I thought there was a little bit of a divide between whoever took the picture and understanding of math skills, because I don't think a 10, 12-year-old girl, whoever, whatever age she is, would really be doing, I think this is parametric maybe equations, but cosine, pi, no. There's clearly a divide there that's meant to be a little more humorous, but let's get into the project. So we're going to review in our time together 4 main areas, looking at the divide itself, realizing that it's usually what we don't see that hurts us the most. Then we'll look at data, the statistics and findings to determine if there really is a divide. Then the direction. So as believers, what direction are we going to be headed in response to our call to love our neighbor as ourselves? And the theological direction of, should we be ascribing any certain response to this? And is this divide actually a theological issue? And finally, a determination. Circling back to the digital divide, we're going to discuss some possible action steps and options, and actually an idea that has come to me from this project that I hope to actually make a reality. So first one within this whole argument is my stance that I want to take, or my thesis. In response to Jesus' call to love our neighbor, the digital divide can be bridged by ensuring all students have equitable access to technology. This is our moral and ethical responsibility. I want to take this argument apart to make sure that we have the same language and the same terminology and context as we move forward. So when I say all students, I really am talking about all different economic groups, whether it's working class, upper class, homeless, immigrant populations, but mainly within the United States. We're staying here. We know that across the world globally, technology and online learning is approached differently. So we're going to stay here within the United States. But I did want to give us a snapshot of what those students are like, or who they are represented by within the United States, in that in 2019, the percentage of public school students who were English language learners was 10% or more in 12 states. Those are Alaska, California, mostly on the West Coast, and District of Columbia is included in that. Texas reported the highest percentage of ELLs in public schools, around 20%, and in California, it's also at about 18%. So within these demographics that are listed here, although white students are still kind of the majority, for most of these students, there also could be language and learning barriers that we don't quite understand. And the percentage of ELLs was higher for school districts in urban areas than those in less urbanized. And so we want to think too about urban and rural populations when we talk about all students and their learning. We'll get back to that. But one of the interesting statistics that I found was that there's been a startling decline in the number of American children actually attending public schools. So the students that we're seeking to assist are actually more difficult to identify and reach and support. The total K through 12 enrollment dropped by about 3% in the 2021 year compared with the previous one. That is in total, all told, the decline is the largest since the turn of the century. The family ties to schools have been absolutely frayed and disconnected thanks to COVID and the upheaval that brought. There was a quote from the Secretary of Education, Miguel Cardona, said he was supporting providing summer learning and enrichment opportunities, investing in high quality preschools, and being sure that we are really hoping to support our youngest learners, and especially those with developmental delays or disabilities. But the overall picture of things, the diminished enrollment, it goes to confirm what some have observed, that COVID changed everything in the sense of remote learning and drove a lot of families to switch to private schools or to homeschooling. So the final numbers are really kind of yet to be released. And it's really believed that thousands of high schoolers have dropped out of school since their classrooms were shut down last spring or during COVID. And the divide between families and schools is growing wider and wider as technology is trying to reconnect us. There's actually been a disconnect. So the all students piece, it's becoming a lot more complicated and has a lot more layers to it than when we used to have brick and mortar or one room schools where everyone came from the community. This is a different beast to try to manage and to connect with. So the next part of my argument I want to look at is the word equitable access. So I want to make sure I'm being clear that equitable, it does not mean equal, and it does not mean fair. So one really great graphic that we use a lot in education is the idea the picture on the left is equal. I gave everyone the same supports. Well, but they each had different needs. Equity identifies those needs, meets students where they are, and provides the support needed for them to be able to, as we're seeing in this picture, see over the fence. If you take this a step further, if you want to talk about justice, justice would be not having the fence be a solid wall. It would be a chain link fence or something that we could see through so that we wouldn't have to have any of those different supports there. But it's just the idea that the needs of our students and the equity we're trying to provide, there's a lot of variables that go with that. Moving on, of course, technology would seem like a pretty clear idea of what that is, but the technology I'm referencing includes the infrastructures that students cannot influence and yet are impacted by. So when the district decides they're going to provide iPads or Mac computers or something else to the students one-on-one, the district then puts an undue burden on the families to be able to have access to internet services. And the family's respect for the device is sometimes questionable. A student's ability to even navigate the platform or learning management system that's being utilized. There are so many different layers to the technology that I'm referencing here, so we can't assume that technology is always positive or helpful. To go back to our Slack and Wise text on page 15, they stated that assumptions gain power because culturally we equate the development of new technology with material and moral betterment without making the assumptions explicit. So many people assume that by giving technology to a student, they're making that student's life and learning better, but that is not always the case, as we're going to find out today. Sometimes it feels like a sort of technological compulsiveness where students are forced to submit to every new technological demand, especially because the technology educational leaders choose to implement requires kind of a level of compliance, but also competency to fulfill the requirements of the school. And I've got an example of that later that I'm really excited to show you. So technology can sometimes be a convenient scapegoat for the problems that actually society should be addressing, and we as believers, as missionaries called to make this world a better place, should be looking into so that we can ensure technology is actually being helpful and isn't causing more harm. The last two pieces I want to look at here is the word moral and the word ethical. So Mildred Bangs, I think it's Wincop, I don't want to say it wrong, A Theology of Love, the Dynamic of Wesleyanism. In that, she talks about morality as the word moral is used to describe the kind of being the biblical writers seem to have in mind as they speak about man's relationship to God and his will. So we seek to understand the nature of man as made in God's image more adequately through moral decisions. But she's very clear to point out that moral is not a biblical word, but it reflects biblical meaning, because it's our responsibility to act in relation to right and wrong, true and false, because we are responsible for the decisions we make. And our response to issues we deem as bad or false or wrong forms our moral nature. So in other words, a moral nature, she writes, is capable of integrity and goodness, is defined as moral integrity, and badness as absence of integrity. So within this moral piece, it's an integrity issue concerning the digital divide and technology. The integrity and goodness we utilize in our response to the digital divide is a reflection of God's image working in our life, not our personal level of holiness necessarily. All right. And finally, ethical piece. As someone who is in the profession of education, we have an ethical standard and duty and a commitment to the student and to our profession. In fact, the phrase that we use within our commitment when we take a job, when we are meeting together as educators is, the educator strives to help each student realize his or her potential as a worthy and effective member of society. The educator therefore works to stimulate the spirit of inquiry, the acquisition of knowledge and understanding, and the thoughtful formulation of worthy goals. In fulfillment of the obligation to the student, the educator shall not, on the basis of race, color, creed, sex, national origin, marital status, political or religious beliefs, family, social or cultural background, or sexual orientation, unfairly exclude any student from participation in any program, deny benefits to any student, grant any advantage to any student. So the code clearly mandates that teachers respect students' civil rights and not discriminate against them. And for many, and for my purposes of this project, access to technology and digital information should be seen as a civil right. Yet, when the digital divide occurs, it excludes many students from participating in those items I just listed, in learning at a deeper level, of participating in inquiry, of having access to information that's there. So the ethical side of the profession itself demands that this divide be addressed and be hopefully filled and taken care of. So let's look at the divide itself. I've chosen this picture. This is a bridge over the Royal Gorge in Colorado. I went there with my family. We took the little gondola over. Boys were scared to death. This is a beautiful feat of engineering and just nature and man working together, in my opinion. But the thing I love about bridges is that no one builds a bridge unless there is a clear starting and ending point. And for some reason, that bridge absolutely had to be there. There's no way you're getting down, across, and back up without some serious effort. So the bridge helps to alleviate the problem that's there. The gorge that's in this picture, I had to look up the definition of gorge: a narrow valley between hills or mountains, typically with steep rocky walls and a stream running through it. Well, this gorge is not the Grand Canyon. It's not a huge, wide thing. But within education and the digital divide, many educators and scholars and researchers have said that although it may seem small right now, that gap or that little gorge can turn into a chasm and a huge gap to fill if we're not careful. And COVID-19 showed us that we need a bridge. It was the equity check that absolutely illuminated just how wide some gaps and gorges and valleys were occurring when it comes to technology and education. But even before COVID, we were identifying two types of divides. The first one being the digital divide. So actual access to the technology itself, having a phone, having a computer, having a tablet. The other piece is the usage divide. So I gave everyone the same tablet, I gave them all a computer. However, one group does not understand how to utilize it correctly or appreciate it as the tool it is meant to be. So here's some examples just between middle income children and lower income or disadvantaged children. So within those two divides, usually they start using it at a younger age versus later. But really, the most important part here is the adult assistance that is or is not present. When I worked in a Title I school, many of my children or my students were taking their iPads home, but their parents were actually using the iPad to access things for job, for health, for banking, for everything else. But also the kids were staying up until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning watching YouTube videos on their iPad. And the parents did not understand how to navigate this new tool that had come into the home and had really upset a lot of the rhythms that were there. So within economically disadvantaged households, a lot of gaming and entertainment are happening. And yet in the upper level homes, they have other ways to find that entertainment. And so they actually use it to gather information. And what they found in a lot of these studies too was that teachers who are working with middle to upper income families used the technology and the tools to communicate with families. Whereas the Title I and lower, they did not use that as much. Everything was still paper communication back and forth. So again, creating a divide between even the usage piece and the accessibility to it. I did want to try to make a connection within our Slack text with the articulations that I found. I saw all of these and I thought, the articulations that are identified here, they really intermingle in different ways, and they create a web that really could be referenced as an assemblage for the digital divide. So it's this thing, if I'm remembering all of my terms correctly, it's so many layers and it's so many ways to try to come at the problem and also to develop solutions. Because within each of these, pick any one of them, there is tracking that occurs for our students. So when designing new units that emphasize especially digital learning, digital citizenship, utilizing technology in an ethical and moral way, teachers use those elements in their new units with their advanced track classes because classroom management and content pacing weren't an issue. Those kiddos kind of came pre-packaged, ready to go, so they felt like they could add on the technology piece within the educational experience. But when we use tracking with kiddos in schools, that closely correlates with race and income, unfortunately. So in practice, teachers devoted their ed tech planning energy toward their already affluent and advantaged students and left the other ones behind. We had the same amount of time together. We were in the same class together, but you required more energy from me to handle classroom management, or you're behind in your reading. And instead of then helping you see how technology can help you move forward in this race, like this picture's looking at, and identifying any obstacles that are there and helping get rid of those, I'm just going to take the technology off and go back to the basics. And sometimes that's great, but sometimes it is a real disadvantage. So there is an incredible documentary called Without a Net, The Digital Divide in America. And it takes two high schools that are in different counties, but they are close to each other in Kentucky. I think you actually could walk between them if I remember correctly. This is not the documentary. This is a trailer, though. It's about a 1-minute trailer that I just want us to watch so that we can hear the differences and see the differences in these two schools and how they use technology.
The way that our robots work is we have code on a laptop that we can then download onto the brain of the robot here.
Today in school, I don't think I will use a computer at all.
Our hopes for the future are very technology dependent.
Not having internet has been difficult because most everything is internet-based, so there's a lot more stress on the students to find a way to actually do their homework.
It's just exciting knowing that I'm going to go to college, like my dream is coming true.
We grew up living poor. We want to see what it's like to have a chance.
So that's a documentary from National Geographic that they did, and it is absolutely fascinating to see the issues that are present there. And if that doesn't pull the heartstrings, I don't know what does. So while we want to remain focused on that human variable that we just talked about, the numbers also speak volumes when it comes to identifying this data divide. So according to the FCC, as of 2019, over 21.3 million people lacked access to high-speed internet. Low-income families also tended to lack multiple smartphones and devices for students to share in remote learning. And a Pew Research report concluded that 35% of students lacked access to broadband across the United States. And the quality, so remember we talked about the two different divides, the quality of remote learning is decided by 4 factors: accessibility to remote learning, quality of learning, home support, and level of engagement. So this pulls at the idea that just giving a student a tablet or a computer is not solving the problem. In fact, it might be identifying even more divides within how our families and our students interact with that technology. And in 2019, almost 100% of children, they had a house that had a computer or a smartphone. Somebody's got it. But dig a little bit deeper, 94% lived in a household with internet, but 6% of those only had internet through a smartphone. So if mom and dad don't pay the bill for our mobile device, we don't have internet. So actually it's not coming through the house and through a fiber, it's coming off of a phone. And 5.4% of children lived in a household with absolutely no internet at all. So even though 98% of them had a computer or a smartphone, almost 5.5% of them have no internet whatsoever, which leads us to 17% of students being unable to complete their homework due to limited access to internet, and 50% of low-income families, 42% of families of color don't have the technology required for online education. So we're saying to our educators, prepare students for the future, get them ready for jobs in technology. And yet we are not addressing the issue of children not having access to the internet or to tools that help them understand how to use that information. I found a story about a family, and we are not going to watch the whole thing. We're going to watch the first minute and a half or so. This family does not have internet at home, and yet this mother is doing everything she can to ensure that her children are learning what they're learning and fulfilling what the school has compulsorily asked them to do. So let's watch a little of it and hear their story.
It's 4:27. But on days that the library closes at 6, we have to go straight from school, straight to the library, because if not, then we don't have enough time before they close. Do you have anything that you can work on while we're waiting?
No, I have. See, that's it.
So everything's on computer.
This is life when you're offline.
Rushing to get there, rushing while we're there. Do we have a space?
Meet Christina and her 4 kids, baby Sebastian, Abel, Alina, and Elias. They're some of the 75 million people across the U.S. who don't have internet access. That's 1 in 4 households. And in some big cities, it's far worse. In New Orleans, 33%, 40% in Detroit, and here in Miami, a full 36%, with no web access at home or even on their cell phones. They're completely off the grid.
Yes. Now I am reserving the computers, 3 computers we need.
And except for the baby, they all need the internet.
This reservation is Abel.
Think of the reasons: to find housing, access government services, or to find a job and apply.
I don't have to wait. Yes. Yes.
1 in 3 students in Miami-Dade isn't connected outside of school. For many, the library is the only option, and resources are stretched thin.
What's the longest you guys have ever had to wait? The costs of the digital divide are extremely damaging for children. So if they don't have connections when they're in school, they're going to have a harder time competing, applying for colleges. Then it perpetuates itself in this negative cycle.
A couple websites, you cannot do it at school. You have to do it here. Like mathematics, if you don't do them all, that's about 10 Fs right there. You only got an hour on this, and an hour goes by like that. My time's up.
Last fall, Christina first told her story to the Miami Herald.
Yes. No, I need to log you in.
Today, things are even tougher.
Elias, let me see. Can you hold him? Okay.
Have you ever had internet access at home?
Yes, I did. Because I was married before, and we had a home and we had a computer there. But when I was, when we were splitting up, that's when things took a big downturn.
She lost her job and decided to study nursing. Now all of her classwork is online too. If you were to sign up for internet, you'd have to sacrifice something else.
I just basically couldn't afford it because.
So when I hear these stories, my brain immediately goes to a phrase we use in education a lot, Maslow over Bloom. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I need to know that I have a roof over my head, that I am safe, that I am going to be fed, that my basic needs are going to be met. Then I can move to Bloom's taxonomy, which moves up the idea of depth of knowledge in the sense of the verbs that I'm using. I'm moving from identifying to applying or evaluating or analyzing. I'm hearing this mother having to choose between paying her rent, buying food for the family, or having internet. How can this be allowed in a society that requires students to do their work online, but we don't fill in the gap for that divide? All right, so moving on, let's talk about the direction we should go. So digital disparities are social issues. They're not just educational problems to be solved. And the biblical commandment I want to point back to is where to love God, to love others. That provides a direction for our response to the digital divide. And scripture provides direction for the theology behind our actions and our interventions, especially when we think back to the idea of our identity coming from who we serve and who we are made in the likeness of. So when it comes to self-revelation and being, Slack and Wise recognize that identity and technology are intimately related. So our identity is a sense of unity and coherence that can be felt and lived and attributed to our sense of self. Well, if my sense of self comes from this scripture in Genesis, where God made us in his image, if God then tells me to take off my old self and put on a new self where I'm renewed and I am caring for others, I'm God's handiwork, I'm here to do good works. Understanding that sense of self through our relationship with Christ creates expressions of assemblages that occur outside of data gathering and interactions with technology. Scripture says about our identity and our being, who we're supposed to be, and how we're supposed to interact with the world and our fellow man. So going back to our Brock text that we read at the very beginning, he wrote about the social matrix, about our thoughts, our communications, our habitual behaviors. This idea that technology within education is completely infused in all of those things. So the ideas that we have to guide our exploration of the world, but those ideas have to always be formed and reformed because the world refuses to conform to our thought schema. We have to move into that realm. And human dignity is found in, that's right, this is a quote from Brock. Human dignity is found in serving as a midwife in the ongoing self-revelation of being, in finding a way to cooperate or serve the becoming of being. So my internal and my external initiatives and how I interact with technology in the world helps to create this self-revelation of who I am and how I fit into things. But how can students form ideas when they are excluded from the social matrix of being with others? If being made in the image of Christ means I have internal and external initiatives for the betterment of my brother, of my neighbor. So we can come up with some pretty radical ideas. We're living in this era of this postmodern sensibilities, but by reforming our idea of being human, we can nurture our understanding of family, society, community, tradition. Michael Lodahl challenges us to redirect our thoughts. He says, let's try to think or rethink what it means to be human, for that idea of being, in 5 ways. He challenges us to move from being solitary subjects to subjects who long to be with others. Move from being autonomous to drinking deeply from relating with others. Move from being independent to being interdependent with each other. From being an objective knower to situated interpreter and involved doer. I love that idea of an involved doer and interpreting things in a new way because we have a new lens. And finally, moving from solitary, immortal souls to a member of the body of Christ. So by rethinking our identity and humanity, we begin to share others' burdens, and we're aware not only of our own struggles, but the struggles and issues others might face. Which leads us to our story of the Good Samaritan and coming near. Again, within Lodall's writings and his speech that I read, he really challenged me and challenges us to ensure that our initial desire to define ourselves is not limited by defining others, but instead we have this fluid interaction back and forth. He talks about the Good Samaritan as a story that some people get a little backward, where they start to focus on who is my neighbor. Well, when we look at it as who is my neighbor, that allows me to kind of draw a line in the sand concerning, oh, that's your problem, not mine. Or I help these people, not those. Jesus is not asking us to define who our neighbor is. I think we've covered that in the basics of this presentation. Instead, he's asking us to be the neighbor, to draw near to those who maybe are a little different than us, maybe are facing a trial or an issue that we don't understand or have to battle with. The direction I would like for us to look at is becoming a neighbor to all people, the outcast, the enemy, the non-neighbor, because there's this idea of social holiness, which is reflected in social grace. I look on you with grace. Going back to Mildred Wincoop's idea that the moral nature, the being filled with a life of integrity and goodness, that's where our moral integrity is seen as being gracious to others and living in covenant with not only our Creator, but also our community, drawing near to be the neighbor. That is our calling. Our scripture talks about love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind. First and greatest commandment. The second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. But instead of asking who your neighbor is, ask how you can be a neighbor. So our final piece, the determination. Where can we go from here? There is a community school idea from a United Way article that I found, and I would like for us to look at some of the ways they've addressed some issues versus how maybe churches could build on that as well. So digital equity in education is considered a civil right if every student is expected to be given an equal opportunity to succeed. So there are 3 areas that the Department of Education have recognized as being potential barriers. And so then they've looked into solutions of availability, affordability, and adoption. While all of these ideas here seem very doable, what I'd like to challenge us to do is to replace where it says organizations, public spaces, or programs. Replace those words with churches. So I see here under availability, use of public spaces and community partnerships to establish internet access. What if we said use of churches and community partnerships to establish internet access? What if within distribution of hotspots and devices, we allowed students to come to our churches and to have free internet for a block of time, and we provide some snacks, and we ensure that this digital divide is closed or at least maybe shortened, and that bridge is built like we talked about before. One article I found is a teacher that said using Google Maps, donors choose, parent donations, even redesigning lessons to understand that not all students have the internet. These are some great next steps that we could do. But I also want to make sure that we understand that as a church, even as we are reaching our community, sometimes within technology, we forget that they don't know how to be good consumers of the information we're putting out there. So we want to make sure that we're redesigning things to align with it. Finally, as my last slide, I promise, returning back to the argument that in response to Jesus' call to love our neighbor, the digital divide can be bridged by ensuring all students have equitable access to technology. This is our moral and ethical responsibility. I've actually reached out to our community director at our church to talk about offering internet to students who do not have it at home, to partner with our university and others in the area for education candidates and for ministry majors to come and act as tutors to fulfill their need for volunteer hours or anything else that they need to do, but just to provide a safe space for students to have access to internet, for parents to have access for telemed appointments or job opportunities. The local library, the McDonald's, the Starbucks, they can only do so much. It's interesting to me that churches have not been seen as a place that could potentially build a bridge or completely fill the digital divide that occurs for so many families. Finally, here's my bibliography slides. And thank you so much for your time, and I hope you have a wonderful day.